What happens when the person trusted to protect passengers becomes the very source of harm? On Flight 3705, 10-year-old Malik Carter boarded with nothing more than a backpack, a coloring book, and his mother's instructions to be polite and say please and thank you. But a simple request for apple juice spiraled into something no child should ever endure. A clenched fist, a brutal strike, and silence that hung heavy over the cabin. The passengers froze, horrified. A young attendant hesitated, torn between loyalty and conscience. And in seat 1A, a federal judge watched every detail unfold with eyes that saw more than violence. He saw injustice waiting to be dismantled. Why did a man sworn to serve see defiance in a boy's politeness? Why did an airline's silence allow patterns of abuse to fester? And how far would a father go to seek justice, not only for his son, but for every child who dared to fly alone? This is not just a story about one punch on one plane. It is about power, prejudice, and what happens when truth refuses to stay quiet. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss the stories that matter most. The cabin of North Sky Flight 2703 hummed with the low vibration of preparation. Passengers shuffled down the narrow aisle, tucking bags into overhead bins, murmuring polite excuse-me's as they adjusted themselves into leather seats. The smell of reheated coffee mixed faintly with jet fuel, creating that familiar scent that told every traveler they were about to leave the ground. In seat 2B, near the window, a boy sat quietly. 10-year-old Malik Carter pressed the corners of his backpack down beneath the seat, making sure it wouldn't spill out. A small, laminated tag dangled from a thin chain around his neck, unaccompanied minor. He touched it once, instinctively, as if to remind himself why the gate agent had walked him to this very spot. His mother had kissed his cheek before boarding and told him 3 simple rules: smile, be polite, and say please and thank you. Malik had promised he would. He wasn't the type to cause trouble. His teachers often said he was thoughtful, too old for his age. That day, he was simply excited to look out the window as the plane climbed into the sky. But there was someone else who noticed him. At the front of the cabin, Flight Attendant Ethan Rowe adjusted the crisp sleeves of his uniform. He had been working for North Sky for over a decade, long enough to master the art of efficiency, but also long enough to hide his disdain when he felt it. As his eyes landed on Malik in the priority cabin, his expression shifted. A child sitting in a space usually reserved for business travelers, it didn't sit right with him. He smoothed his tie, jaw tight, and moved down the aisle. Malik didn't notice at first. He had pulled a coloring book from his backpack, the one his father had slipped in that morning with a box of new crayons. The boy was tracing the outline of a car when Ethan stopped just a few steps away. "Juice," Malik said softly when the attendant passed. "Excuse me, may I please have some apple juice?" It was a request so small, so polite, it should have gone unnoticed. But Ethan's face hardened. His voice came back sharp, louder than it needed to be. "We're out," he snapped. Malik blinked. He reached carefully into the seat pocket, pulling out the laminated menu. "But it says apple juice," he said, his tone not defiant, not demanding just innocent confusion. That was when the air changed. Ethan's shoulders squared, his lips pressing into a line so thin it was nearly invisible. His eyes narrowed, focusing on the child as though he had said something far more dangerous. He leaned in slightly, his presence filling the small space around Malik's seat. "Watch your tone," Ethan muttered. The words sliced through the calm hum of the cabin. Malik's heart thudded in his chest. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't meant disrespect. He remembered his mother's rules and knew he had followed them exactly. His voice trembled as he looked up, eyes wide. I wasn't being rude," he said softly. Passengers nearby shifted, half aware that something had changed. A woman across the aisle tightened her grip on her handbag. A teenager, 3 rows back, lifted his phone halfway, uncertain if there was really anything worth recording yet. And, in seat 1A, a man in a navy suit lowered his tablet just slightly, his eyes flicking up. Judge Adrian Cole had spent years observing people in silence before rendering judgment. Now, he noticed the tiny details, the way Ethan's fingers flexed at his side, the faint twitch in his jaw, the storm barely contained under a uniform. He said nothing yet. He only watched. For Malik, the world suddenly felt heavier. The seat belt across his lap pressed tighter. The coloring book, now forgotten on the tray table. His stomach knotted. He wanted nothing more than to vanish into the hum of the engines, to disappear before this man's anger spilled over. But Ethan didn't step back. He moved closer, blocking the aisle with his body. His voice was low, but sharp enough to cut. I said, "Watch your tone." The boy swallowed, his throat dry. His mother had told him grown-ups respected politeness, that adults liked children who behaved. He had done everything right, and yet this man looked at him as if he were a threat. Malik's small voice trembled again. "I wasn't being rude," he whispered. For a second, there was silence. The engines outside roared to life, vibrating through the floor. The cabin crew gave final calls for seat belts, and the aircraft began to push back from the gate. But in row 2B, gravity itself seemed to thicken. Malik felt it pressing into him, and he realized too late that his innocence had just collided with something darker. Ethan's jaw tightened further. His eyes had shifted from annoyance to fury, the kind of fury that didn't belong in the aisle of an airplane but had found its way there anyway. His fists clenched, his breathing shallow, as though he had decided the boy in seat 2B needed to learn a lesson. Malik didn't understand why. He only knew that the storm was coming. And from seat 1A, Judge Cole closed his tablet, his sharp gaze now fully locked on the scene. He had seen enough to know something was about to happen. The boy in the window seat still believed he could explain his way out. He didn't yet realize he was standing at the edge of something that would change his life forever. He looked back down at the menu in his lap and whispered one more time, almost pleading. It says, "apple juice." Those 4 words, spoken in pure innocence, were about to unleash everything. The silence inside the cabin was the kind that made every sound sharper. The click of a seatbelt, the rustle of a newspaper, the faint thud of luggage being shoved deeper into the overhead bin. Each small noise seemed to echo, filling the space that had grown thick between the boy and the man towering over him. Malik Carter kept his eyes lowered, fixed on the laminated menu in his hands. His fingers gripped the edge so tightly his knuckles turned pale. He wasn't sure what had gone wrong. He had asked politely. He had pointed to the printed words, and yet the man in the uniform seemed to grow angrier with every second. Flight Attendant Ethan Rowe stood rigid, his fists flexing at his sides. His jaw twitched. A vein pulsed at his temple, and his body language screamed of a storm building with nowhere to go. His voice came again, louder this time, the words rolling like thunder across the narrow cabin. Watch your tone." Malik's heart raced. His throat tightened as he whispered back, "I wasn't being rude." That was the final spark. Ethan's fist flew forward with brutal speed. For a heartbeat, time seemed to shatter. The sound of knuckles against bone cracked through the cabin like a gunshot. Malik's small head snapped violently to the side, slamming into the armrest. A sickening thud followed as his temple struck metal. Then the sharp clink of his unaccompanied minor tag hitting the tray table. Gasps erupted around them. A woman clutched her chest. A teenage boy's phone slipped from his hands and clattered to the floor. An elderly passenger whispered a prayer, but the most haunting sound was Malik's silence. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. Only a faint whimper escaped his lips as blood began to trickle from the corner of his mouth. His jaw hung at an unnatural angle, swelling rapidly, bruising already painted across his small face. His coloring book slid to the floor, a crayon rolling under the seat. For several seconds, the cabin froze in collective disbelief. It was as though the air had been sucked from the plane, leaving only shock behind. Then chaos rushed in. A man leapt from his seat 2 rows back, eyes wide in outrage. Another passenger scrambled for his phone, shaking so badly he could barely focus the lens. The teenage boy who had fumbled his phone earlier now grabbed the call button repeatedly, his voice cracking as he shouted for help. Through it all, Ethan Rowe remained standing, chest heaving, fists still clenched. His face carried no panic, no remorse, only a simmering righteousness, as though the violence had been justified. "He got smart," Ethan muttered, his voice harsh and defensive. "Disrespect like that earns a lesson." The words cut deeper than the punch. They sank into the air, poison in it. Passengers shifted in their seats, their disbelief turned into anger, but none moved forward. Fear of the uniform, fear of escalation, pinned them in place. At the front of the cabin, a younger attendant stood frozen near the galley curtain. Jason Lee, barely into his 20s, clutched his radio with trembling hands. He had witnessed everything, and yet his body hesitated between loyalty to a colleague and horror at what had just happened. Then a voice broke through the chaos. "Call medical," said Judge Adrian Cole from seat 1A. His tone was calm, steady, but it carried authority that pierced the haze. Jason snapped to attention, nodding quickly before disappearing behind the curtain to the intercom. Malik groaned softly, his face pressed against the armrest. His breath came in shallow bursts, each exhale wet and shaky. Blood stained the collar of his shirt. He tried to move, but the pain was too sharp. Judge Cole rose from his seat. He was tall, his tailored suit crisp, his expression unreadable but firm. He stepped slowly into the aisle, his shoes tapping softly against the floor. His eyes locked on Ethan. For a moment, the cabin seemed to shrink to just the two of them, the flight attendant still buzzing with adrenaline, and the judge radiating a calm authority that made the air vibrate. Ethan's chest rose and fell rapidly. His fists stayed clenched, but his voice rose louder as if volume could rewrite reality. "I said he got smart. You all saw it." He talked back. No one responded. Judge Cole took another step closer, his voice steady but sharp. "And you decided that justified violence. Don't twist it," Ethan snapped, his face flushed, his eyes darting briefly to the passengers filming him. "He disrespected me. I gave him a warning." Judge Cole glanced down at Malik's small, broken body slumped in the seat. The boy hadn't moved except for the painful flutter of his chest. The judge raised the silver boarding pass still in his hand. I was in row 1A. I heard everything. Ethan's mouth opened, but no words came. Recognition flickered across his face. He realized too late that this wasn't an ordinary passenger standing before him. The curtain parted again, and Jason reappeared, voice shaking. "Medical teams are meeting us at the gate. They're bringing a stretcher." A ripple of relief passed through the passengers, but the tension didn't ease. Phones were raised higher now, lenses capturing every detail. A man, 2 rows back, angled his camera to catch both Ethan and the judge. "Don't record me," Ethan barked, his fist still tight, but the phone stayed up. Judge Cole ignored the outburst and turned his calm gaze toward the passengers. "I need you all to stay seated. Medical will be here shortly." The engines beneath them hummed lower as the plane began its descent. Outside, the city lights of New Haven glimmered faintly against the darkening sky. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, ordering an expedited landing. Inside. Ethan shifted backward toward the galley, as though retreat might restore his control. His lips pressed into a thin line. "What's your name?" Judge Cole asked. Ethan hesitated. "I asked you a question." The judge pressed, his voice still even but now sharper. Ethan's jaw twitched again. "Finally," he muttered. Ethan Rowe." Judge Cole nodded once. "Mr. Rowe, you've just made a very serious mistake." The wheels screeched against the tarmac as Flight 2703 landed with a jarring bump. Outside the windows, red and blue emergency lights flashed across the runway. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder as the plane taxied to a stop. The cabin was silent except for Malik's soft whimpers. Every passenger's gaze stayed fixed on him, on the boy who had asked for juice and been met with violence. The door opened with a hiss. Paramedics rushed aboard, their faces masks of calm efficiency. One knelt beside Malik, speaking softly as he checked his pulse. "Can you hear me? Buddy, nod if you can." Malik's eyelids fluttered. He gave the faintest nod, his lips trembling with effort. The passengers exhaled in collective relief, but Judge Cole did not relax. His eyes stayed locked on Ethan, who stood rigid at the front of the cabin, shoulders squared as though he still believed he could control the narrative. "You struck a child," the judge said quietly, almost to himself, but loud enough for Ethan to hear. "And now, Mr. Rowe, the consequences have landed." The paramedics lifted Malik gently onto a collapsible stretcher, securing his neck in a brace and covering him with a thin blanket. His small hands clutched the fabric as they wheeled him toward the door. Passengers leaned into the aisle, watching in stunned silence, some whispering prayers, others shaking their heads. As Malik disappeared down the jet bridge, cameras flickered from the waiting crowd outside. Reporters had been tipped off. The story was already breaking before the plane even emptied. Ethan Rowe stood frozen, his fists finally unclenching. For the first time, a flicker of unease crossed his face. Judge Adrian Cole didn't flinch. He smoothed his tie, straightened his posture, and followed the paramedics down the aisle. He had seen enough. He knew exactly what had to happen next. And Ethan Rowe, who thought he had silenced a child, had no idea that his actions had awakened a storm far bigger than himself. The ambulance doors swung open with a metallic thud, and the paramedics moved swiftly down the ramp into the fluorescent glow of St. Luke's Memorial Hospital. Malik lay on the stretcher, his face swollen, jaw wrapped in stabilizing gauze, his small hands gripping the thin blanket like it was an anchor. The boy's eyes opened briefly, then fluttered closed again, the effort of staying awake too heavy for his injured body. The automatic doors parted with a mechanical sigh, and suddenly the air changed. Gone was the recycled hum of the airplane cabin. Here it was, the sharp tang of antiseptic, the steady beep of monitors, the shuffle of rubber soles across polished floors. Nurses appeared, efficient and expressionless, guiding the stretcher into trauma observation. Judge Adrian Cole followed closely, his long strides purposeful yet restrained. He had seen many scenes of violence in courtrooms, had read transcripts of brutality that still lingered in his mind. But witnessing a child struck down in real time carried a weight that the law books could never capture. He gave his name and title quietly to the charge nurse, his voice low but firm. The information was noted, and he was guided toward the waiting area. Malik was wheeled through swinging doors, leaving behind only the faint trail of blood across the sheet. The boy's soft whimper echoed once more, then faded. Minutes stretched into an hour. Passengers from the flight trickled into the waiting room, some giving brief statements to airport security officers who had followed. Phones buzzed. Reporters gathered outside, and still the boy lay behind closed doors. The glass doors at the hospital's main entrance burst open just as the wall clock ticked toward 9. Darius Carter stormed in. His presence filled the sterile space with raw, unfiltered urgency. He wore a black button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up, his frame tall and unyielding. His eyes scanned the room like a man trained to assess, to calculate, to react. "I need my son, Malik Carter. He was brought in from a flight," he said, his voice low but shaken at the edges. The receptionist pointed quickly toward Trauma Room 3B. She had seen the look before, the kind of gaze that didn't wait for permission. Darius did not thank her. He moved like a man who had been cut open and was trying to stop the bleeding with sheer will. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, lined with muted posters and sterile tiles. When he finally stepped into 3B, his pace faltered. Malik lay on the bed, small beneath the tangle of wires and machines. His jaw was wrapped tight, a drip running into his arm, the steady blip of a monitor marking his fragile rhythm. A nurse adjusted the equipment, glancing up at the father's sudden presence. For the first time since boarding the plane, Malik stirred, his eyelids fluttered, his swollen face shifting slightly at the sound of footsteps. He could not speak, but his eyes found his father. Darius crossed the room slowly, like a soldier approaching a battlefield already lost. His hand trembled as he reached for his son's, brushing back a stray curl from the boy's forehead. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm here, son." Malik's eyes glistened, then closed again, his tiny hand tightening weakly around his father's fingers. The nurse spoke softly. "We're running scans now. The fractures are significant. The doctors will brief you as soon as possible." Darius gave a stiff nod but did not look away from his son. His face remained still, but his jaw clenched with each shallow breath Malik took. He had spent years in war rooms and strategy halls, planning deployments that stretched across continents, predicting crises, preparing responses. But nothing had prepared him for this sight. His child, broken not by an accident or illness, but by the rage of a man who was supposed to serve and protect. He bent lower, his lips close to Malik's ear. "Who did this to you?" The boy's grip tightened once more, but no words came. He did not need to answer. Darius already knew. In another wing of the hospital, Ethan Rowe sat in a private security room at Sky Harbor Airport, his arms crossed tightly. He insisted on waiting for his union representative before saying anything. He muttered to investigators that the boy had moved too close, had startled him, that he had reacted on instinct. He denied striking Malik outright, claiming that injuries came from a fall, but the investigators already had the evidence. A passenger's phone video had been uploaded within minutes. Another copy had landed directly in Judge Adrian Cole's office. The images were damning. Meanwhile, in the hospital's pediatric wing, Darius sat by his son's bedside. He did not speak. He did not rage. He watched. The glow of the monitor reflected off his face as he replayed the video on his phone again and again. Every frame seared into his memory. The moment Ethan's fist connected, the sound of Malik's small body crumpling. His jaw tightened until it ached. Darius Carter was known among his colleagues for his calm under fire. Haven Systems had trusted him to manage global logistics, to run simulations of disaster and find pathways through chaos. He was measured, analytical, never given to impulsive reaction. But now, as he sat in that hospital room, he felt a storm gathering inside him. It was not the chaos of panic. It was precision sharpening itself into a blade. A soft knock came at the door. A hospital liaison stepped in, his voice tentative. "Mr. Carter, there has been some movement on the investigation. I thought you'd want to know." Darius turned slowly. His eyes were steady, his voice cold. "I want every name, every record, anyone who signed off on that man's employment. I want it all." The liaison hesitated, shifting uneasily. "We're working on it, sir." "Work faster," Darius said, his tone quiet but cutting. He looked back at Malik, his voice softening just slightly. He chose the wrong boy. Outside, cameras flashed at the hospital entrance as news crews assembled. The story was already making its way across networks, climbing headlines faster than officials could manage. Words like assault, brutality, and accountability lit up screens. Protesters began to gather in the plaza outside Skyreach Airlines' downtown headquarters. Judge Adrian Cole left the hospital shortly before midnight. He knew what came next. His testimony would carry weight. But, more importantly, he knew Darius Carter was not a man to pace hospital floors helplessly. He was a man who dismantled systems, and somewhere deep in his heart, the judge knew that Ethan Rowe, in his arrogance, had triggered a battle far larger than he could ever control. The night in St. Luke's Memorial was long. Machines beeped, nurses whispered, and Malik drifted in and out of shallow sleep. Darius remained at his side, motionless except for the slow tightening of his grip around his son's hand. He had already made a silent promise. This would not be buried. This would not be explained away. Not this time. But dawn. The city was already awake with fury, and Darius Carter, calm and cold, was ready to move. The city outside the hospital never slept. Neon signs buzzed above late-night diners, traffic hummed along rain-slick streets, and somewhere in a corporate tower miles away, the crisis team at Skyreach Airlines sat in a sterile conference room. The walls were glass, overlooking a skyline that blinked with aircraft warning lights. Inside, executives whispered in clipped tones, their faces pale under fluorescent strips. Phones buzzed every few seconds. On one wall, a large screen showed the first news broadcast replaying shaky phone footage of Flight 702, the moment Ethan Rowe's fist connected with Malik Carter's jaw. The silence afterward was heavier than any commentary. A woman in a tailored gray suit, head of corporate communications, spoke with urgency. "We need a statement now, something neutral, something that acknowledges without admitting liability." The CEO, Leonard Graves, rubbed his temples. He was a tall man with thinning hair, his tie pulled loose. "We wait. If we speak too soon, we'll box ourselves in. Let the union handle Roe. He's their problem." Another executive, younger, leaned forward. "With respect, sir, he's not just their problem. He's ours. That boy is 10 years old. There's a federal judge on the witness list. This isn't going away." Graves's eyes narrowed. "Then we do what we've always done. Contain, minimize, bury. But outside that tower, in a quiet diner on the east side of the city, Darius Carter was building something very different. He sat in a corner booth, laptop open, coffee cooling beside him. Across the table sat two former colleagues from his years at Haven Systems, men who understood how data trails could be hidden or revealed. Caleb Rohr, a wiry engineer with restless hands, scrolled quickly through files. Lionel Sims, broader and slower in movement but sharp in focus, highlighted blocks of text with a stylus. "This is what we've got so far," Darius said, turning the screen so both men could see. Lines of text scrolled by, stripped of corporate signatures but unmistakable, internal reports, fragments of deleted memos, snippets of passenger complaints. Caleb leaned closer, eyes narrowing. "Look at this. 18 months ago. A report about Roe yelling at a boy with special needs, filed under conduct review, then erased 2 weeks later." Lionel added grimly, "And here, a verbal tirade at an elderly passenger, written off as a misunderstanding. The pattern's clear." Darius sat back, his expression controlled but cold. They knew, they always knew, and they buried it. The men worked for hours, piecing together a map of rot, each incident tied not only to Ethan Roe, but to supervisors who had signed off, shifting blame, rewriting records. Darius tapped a section highlighted in yellow, flagged crew memos rewritten to sound like minor miscommunications. "If we cross-check timestamps, we can find the originals." Caleb glanced up. "This is a fire waiting for oxygen." Darius pulled a slim black flash drive from his coat pocket, sliding it across the table. "Copy everything, encrypt it. Send one to Judge Cole's office. I've already cleared the channel." "Is this enough?" Lionel asked. "It's enough to start," Darius replied. His tone was steady, but the weight beneath it was unmistakable. That night, in a quiet study lined with law books, Judge Adrian Cole read through the manila folder Marcus delivered. The evidence was damning: 6 separate reports involving Roe, each dismissed or erased. Cole turned each page carefully, his brow furrowed deeper with every line. "This is more than misconduct," Cole said at last. His voice carried the authority of someone who had weighed lives and laws for decades. "This is a system designed to protect itself." Darius leaned forward, his face still and calm. This wasn't a breakdown. This was a fuse waiting to blow. And now the charge is detonated. Meanwhile, in a secure office downtown, Ethan Roe sat beside his attorney, a silver-haired man named Grant Maruro. The room smelled of polished wood and old leather, walls lined with framed degrees. Grant leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "They're going to come hard," he said evenly. "But that's noise. What matters is what we put on record. You were provoked. You felt threatened. You acted on instinct." Ethan's jaw twitched. It was one punch. He wouldn't let it go. Grant's tone sharpened. Never say that again. Not to me. Not to anyone. You're not the villain. You're the man caught in a situation gone sideways. Stick to that, and we can soften the blow. Ethan nodded, but his eyes betrayed something darker. Not remorse, not fear, but annoyance that anyone thought he was wrong at all. He didn't know that across the city. The walls around him were already crumbling. 2 nights later, an anonymous whistleblower under the alias Cabin Truth leaked a cache of emails to 3 independent outlets. The files spread like fire through the night, impossible to contain once released. One line, in particular, hit with brutal clarity. A message Rowe had sent to his supervisor months before. They always think they can talk back if they're young and entitled, especially that kind. By dawn, the phrase filled headlines, scrolling across ticker bars on every major network. Protesters gathered outside Skyreach headquarters, their chants echoing against the glass facade. Signs bobbed above the crowd. Not just a punch. Protect our kids. That kind. We know what you mean. Inside the tower, executives scrambled. Graves paced the floor, sweat beading on his forehead. Find the leak. Contain it. We need control of the narrative, but the narrative was already gone. At St. Luke's Memorial. Darius watched the coverage on a muted television in the pediatric wing. Malik lay sleeping, a faint smile tugging at his lips as a cartoon flickered across the screen. The boy hadn't spoken much since the attack, but his eyes carried more strength each day. Darius muted the TV completely, leaning forward with elbows on his knees. He whispered to himself, "You chose the wrong boy." The battle had moved beyond a single punch. It was no longer just about one man's rage. It was about a culture that had allowed it to fester, shielded by silence, reinforced by those in power, and Darius Carter, patient and relentless, was prepared to dismantle that culture piece by piece. The courthouse steps were crowded before sunrise. Reporters clutched microphones wrapped in plastic against the drizzle. Camera crews jockeyed for angles, and ordinary citizens stood shoulder to shoulder with activists holding cardboard signs inked in hurried strokes. Some signs demanded justice for Malik Carter. Others carried broader messages: protect our children, end abuse in the skies, dignity at 30,000 feet. Inside, the marble lobby echoed with the shuffle of shoes and the murmur of hundreds of voices. Court officers moved in pairs, their radios clipped to shoulders, their expressions tight with the knowledge that today was no ordinary proceeding. In a quiet waiting area off to the side, Darius Carter sat with his son. Malik was in a wheelchair, a thin bandage still wrapped around his jaw. He wore a navy blazer that looked slightly too big for him, sleeves brushing his wrists. Darius crouched beside him, gently adjusting the lap blanket. "You ready, buddy?" His voice was calm, even, but the tension in his eyes betrayed the weight he carried. Malik gave the faintest nod, his lips pressed together, his gaze steady. He was small, still fragile, but there was something in his expression that felt older than 10. When the doors opened and the crowd was ushered inside, the courtroom filled quickly. Wooden pews creaked under the weight of journalists, community leaders, and silent onlookers who had waited hours for this moment. At the front, Judge Wilton Stokes sat high behind the oak bench, his gray brows drawn tight as he reviewed a stack of briefs. At the plaintiff's table, the prosecutor, Harold Hallbrook, organized a series of folders with meticulous care. Darius sat beside him, his hand resting gently on Malik's shoulder on the other side of the room. Ethan Rowe sat stiffly between his two attorneys. His navy suit was crisp, his posture rigid, but his eyes darted often toward the gallery where cameras glinted like predatory eyes. The proceedings began without ceremony. Judge Stokes cleared his throat. This court is convened in the matter of the state versus Ethan Rowe. Mr. Holbrook, you may proceed. The prosecutor rose, his voice measured but strong. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today you will see what happens when a man entrusted with responsibility abuses it in the most violent way possible. You will see that the injury to Malik Carter was not only deliberate, but predictable. You will hear from witnesses who saw it with their own eyes, from experts who will explain the intent behind the movement, and from the victim himself. He lifted a tablet, connected it to the courtroom screen, and pressed play. The footage filled the air with a harsh clarity. Passengers settling into seats, Malik asking politely for apple juice, Rowe's curt response, the boy pointing quietly to the laminated menu, then the sudden explosion of violence, the punch, the sickening crack of bone. Gasps rippled through the room as the video replayed in slow motion. The angle was clear, damning. Holbrook paused the frame mid-swing, Rowe's fist a blur of intent inches from Malik's face. This was not an accident, Holbrook said quietly. This was a decision. Across the courtroom, Ethan shifted uncomfortably. His attorney, Grant Maruro, leaned in to whisper something, but the gallery's eyes were locked on the screen. For a moment, no one breathed. When the prosecution rested for the morning, the defense rose. Grant Maruro smoothed his tie and began pacing slowly before the jury. His voice was calm, confident, designed to soothe. We do not deny that an incident occurred. We do not deny that young Malik was injured. What we will show, however, is that this was not malice. This was instinct, a sudden reflex in the face of perceived aggression. Flight attendants work in confined spaces under immense pressure. Mr. Rowe was startled, and he reacted. He gestured toward the witness box where Dr. Leonard Bryce, a behavioral analyst, took his seat. Bryce adjusted his glasses and spoke with the authority of someone used to lecturing. I observed signs of pre-reflexive startle behavior. He explained. Mr. Rowe's shoulders flinched. His face showed surprise. His arms moved defensively. It is consistent with someone reacting before conscious thought. Fear, not intent. The defense attorney nodded, satisfied. Fear of what? Doctor of perceived physical aggression? Bryce replied. The child's sudden movement could have been interpreted as a threat. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Some jurors leaned forward, others frowned. Darius sat perfectly still, but his jaw tightened. He had expected this argument. He had prepared for it. When the defense rested its case, Holbrook rose again. Without words at first, he wheeled a large monitor to the center and nodded to the judge. Permission to replay the footage. Your Honor, this time with motion map and overlay. The screen lit up once more. This time, digital markers tracked Rowe's body frame by frame, the flex of his shoulders, the tightening of his right hand into a fist, the shift of weight from one foot to the other, the deliberate torque before impact. Pause it there, Holbrook instructed. The image froze, Rowe's knuckles drawn tight, eyes narrowed, jaw clenched. This is not flinch behavior. This is anticipatory aggression. Our expert, Dr. Adrian Bell, will testify that Mr. Rowe did not react in fear. He prepared, and that preparation began before the boy moved at all. Gasps echoed again. One juror covered his mouth, another scribbled furiously in a notebook. The judge leaned forward, his brows heavy with thought. Holbrook then turned toward the plaintiff's table. We will now call our most important witness, Malik Carter. The gallery shifted. The boy's wheelchair creaked as a bailiff carefully guided him forward. Malik stood slowly, his legs unsteady, but his determination unwavering. He climbed the small step into the witness box. His blazer looked oversized, his voice small, but his eyes carried a gravity that silenced the room. Holbrook approached gently. Malik, I'll ask you only 3 questions. If you need to stop, just tell me. Is that okay? Malik nodded. First question. Did you touch or try to touch Mr. Rowe before he struck you? No, Malik said softly. Second question. Did you say anything threatening to him? Again? No. Third question. What did he say to you right before he hit you? The room was still, every breath held. Malik's lips trembled, but he spoke clearly enough for all to hear. He said, "Let's see you talk now." The words hit the room like thunder. Jurors' eyes widened. Reporters scribbled furiously. Even Judge Stokes paused, his gavel hovering over the bench. At the defense table, Ethan's face drained of color. His attorney stiffened, caught off guard. Darius sat frozen, pride and fury warring in his chest. He reached for his son's hand, gripping it gently as Malik stepped down. The boy's small frame looked even smaller against the vastness of the courtroom. But in that moment, he had carried more weight than any lawyer, any judge, any video. The session adjourned for the day. As the room emptied, whispers filled the air. Outside, the sun had broken through the drizzle, casting golden light across the courthouse steps. Reporters swarmed the exit, microphones raised high. Darius wheeled Malik through the throng, ignoring the shouted questions. He kept his eyes on the horizon, his hand steady on the chair. Malik leaned back, exhausted but calm, his gaze soft as it drifted toward the open sky. Inside the defense chamber, Ethan slammed his fist against the table once the door closed. He's milking it. That kid's milking it. Grant Maruro fixed him with a cold stare. Do not say that again. You are not fighting a child anymore. You are fighting a father who knows how to dismantle systems, and he is winning. Ethan's jaw clenched, but for the first time, his confidence faltered. Back at the hospital that evening, Darius tucked Malik into bed. Smoothing the blanket, Malik whispered, his voice barely audible. "Did I do okay, Dad?" Darius kissed his forehead. "You did more than okay. You told the truth, and that truth is stronger than anything they can throw at us." Malik closed his eyes, drifting into sleep. Darius sat in the chair beside him, staring out the window at the night sky. Planes passed silently overhead, their lights blinking in steady rhythm. He whispered to himself, "This isn't just about one man. It's about every boy who ever had his voice stolen, and we are not stopping here." The next morning, the courthouse felt different. The air was heavier, charged, as though everyone who entered sensed that something more was about to surface. By now, the case of State versus Ethan Rowe was national news. The footage had been replayed on every network, slowed down, dissected, argued over by experts and pundits. But there was still an unanswered question haunting the edges of the story. Was Malik truly the first, or just the first whose suffering was impossible to bury inside the courtroom? Judge Stokes took his place, tapping the gavel once for order. His eyes lingered a moment longer on the boy seated beside his father at the plaintiff's table. Malik sat quietly, hands folded in his lap, his jaw still tender beneath the bandages. Darius leaned close, whispering something that made his son straighten just slightly, as if reminded of the strength he carried. The prosecutor, Harold Holbrook, rose slowly. His voice was calm, deliberate. Your Honor, before we continue with expert testimony, the state requests permission to introduce a new witness. This testimony has only recently come to light. Grant Maruro immediately stood from the defense table. Objection. This witness was not on the pre-trial list. We cannot allow ambush testimony. Judge Stokes studied Holbrook. Explain. Holbrook nodded. Last night, a young man contacted our office with information directly relevant to the defendant's pattern of conduct. We verified his account and believe his testimony is essential to establishing a consistent behavior that predates the assault on Malik Carter. The judge's brow furrowed. Name, Felix Ray. Your Honor, age 19. A murmur spread through the gallery. Grant leaned in toward Ethan Rowe, whispering furiously. But the defendant's jaw had already begun to twitch, the telltale sign of unease. The side door opened, and a tall, lean young man entered. His limp was visible even before he reached the stand. Every step carried a weight, not just from injury, but from memory. He took his seat, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at the jury. His expression was steady, practiced, as though he had waited years for this moment. Holbrook approached gently. Mr. Ray, please state your name and age for the record. Felix Ray, 19. Felix, can you tell us why you contacted our office? Felix swallowed once, then spoke. Because what happened to Malik wasn't the first time Ethan Rowe hurt a kid on a plane. It happened to me, too. The gallery stirred, gasped, breaking the silence. Judge Stokes raised a hand. Order. Continue. Felix steadied himself. 5 years ago, I was 14, flying alone from Redwood Bay to Briar Glen. I had trouble lifting my carry-on bag into the overhead bin. I asked for help. Rowe was the attendant in my section. He looked at me and said, "You want to be a man. Act like one. Handle your own weight." He paused, his eyes flicking briefly toward Ethan before returning to the jury. I tried again. The bag slipped. He grabbed my shoulder and shoved me back into my seat. My leg hit the metal armrest hard enough to split the skin. I still have the scar. Felix pulled up his pant leg. A long, jagged scar traced down his shin. Audible gasps filled the room. Did you report this? Holbrook asked. My father did. We even sent pictures. Weeks passed. When he called to follow up, they said there was no record of the complaint. We dropped it because we thought no one would listen. The silence that followed was heavy. Jurors shifted in their seats, faces etched with discomfort. Grant Maruro shot to his feet. Objection. This is anecdotal and prejudicial. The defense moves to strike. Sustained, Judge Stokes said after a pause. The jury is instructed to consider Mr. Ray's testimony only insofar as it may illuminate potential behavioral patterns, not as proof of this specific crime. Felix nodded. He seemed unsurprised. That's all I wanted. To say it out loud. Holbrook's voice softened. Felix, one last question. How did Ethan Rose speak to you that day? Felix's expression hardened, like I was a problem, not a person, like I didn't belong there. The words lingered as he stepped down. Darius Carter's eyes followed him, heavy with both sorrow and recognition. Malik looked at the scar, then at his father, as if silently asking whether this was what awaited children like him when no one intervened. The courtroom broke for recess. Outside, the plaza buzzed like a hive. Reporters swarmed Felix, microphones thrust into his face, but he kept his words short. I told the truth, that's all. He limped away, blending into the crowd, back inside in the defense chamber. Ethan's composure cracked. They're dredging up ghosts. He was nothing, a clumsy kid who wanted attention. Grant pressed his palms flat against the table. Control yourself. Every word you say now can be used against you. Do you understand you're not just on trial for what happened to Malik? You're on trial for who you've always been. Ethan turned away, his jaw tightening. He stared at the floor as if trying to will it into silence. That evening, in a quiet corner of a diner across town, Darius met with Jason Lee, the young flight attendant who had been on Flight 2745. Jason looked shaken, his coffee untouched. He lowered his voice. I've seen things too. I never spoke up. I was scared of losing my job, but I kept notes. Every time Ethan snapped, every time he went too far, I wrote it down. He slid a small notebook across the table. Darius opened it, scrawled dates, flight numbers, terse descriptions, passenger complaint dismissed, raised voice at elderly traveler, threatened junior attendant. They buried these things, Jason whispered. Every time someone spoke up, the reports vanished. It was like he had a shield around him. Darius closed the notebook slowly, his mind sharpened like a blade. He had been here before in another life, piecing together patterns from fragments, dismantling systems built to conceal. He looked at Jason and said, "You've done the right thing now. This won't disappear." Later that night, Darius sat by Malik's bedside. The boy had fallen asleep clutching a stuffed toy, his chest rising and falling in the rhythm of healing. Darius opened his laptop, connecting the fragments Jason had provided with the testimony from Felix. A map of misconduct began to form, not isolated, not accidental, a pattern of harm shielded by bureaucracy and silence. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. His anger had transformed into something colder, sharper. This was never about one punch, he whispered. This was about everything that allowed it to happen, in another part of the city. Felix sat alone in his small apartment. His leg throbbed faintly as he traced the scar with his fingers. For years he had carried it in silence, convinced it was nothing more than bad luck. Now, after speaking in court, he felt a strange lightness. He wasn't just a forgotten kid with a wound. He was a voice added to the chorus. Back in the courthouse, Judge Adrian Cole, who had observed quietly from the gallery since the first day, sat at his desk reviewing the notes from the day's proceedings. He underlined Felix's testimony and wrote in the margin pattern established. He knew what this meant legally. One case was an incident. 2 or more made it a culture, and a culture could be dismantled. When the trial resumed the following morning, the atmosphere was electric. More protesters had gathered outside. Children carried cardboard wings painted bright colors. Adults held placards that read, "No child should fly in fear." As Darius wheeled Malik through the lobby, strangers stepped aside with quiet respect. Some whispered encouragement. Malik gripped the armrest, his eyes wide but unafraid. He had seen the truth spreading, and even in his young heart, he understood that his pain was no longer his alone. It was a spark catching fire. In the defense chamber, Ethan Rowe sat rigid. He didn't look at the reporters, didn't look at the cameras. For the first time, the uniform he once wore with authority felt like a mask stripped away, and beneath it, the world was seeing him clearly. The trial was no longer just about Malik Carter. It was about the hidden victims who had finally stepped into the lot. The courthouse had become more than a building of marble and oak. By the end of the second week, it felt like the center of gravity for the entire city. Reporters clustered in the plaza outside, microphones perched like birds waiting for the next headline. Protesters marched with signs, their chants echoing against the stone walls. Inside, the tension coiled tighter with every passing day. Darius Carter felt it most acutely at night, when the hallways emptied and the quiet was almost unbearable. He would sit by Malik's side in the safe room provided by the courthouse staff. His son would doze, shifting uncomfortably in the hospital chair disguised as a bed, while Darius stared at the ceiling with his mind turning like a machine. The fight was bigger than he had imagined, and every instinct told him the real battle had just begun. The morning session opened with little ceremony. Harold Holbrook, the prosecutor, adjusted his notes and looked at the judge. His tone was steady, but beneath it ran an urgency that only those who had read the late-night emails understood. Your Honor, the state requests permission to admit newly obtained evidence. These files were delivered anonymously to our office less than 12 hours ago. They contain internal communications from Skyward Airlines, specifically referencing the defendant, Ethan Rowe. The gallery stirred, cameras clicked. Grant Maruro rose immediately. Objection. Chain of custody is unclear. Anonymous sources are inherently unreliable. Holbrook lifted a small flash drive sealed in a transparent bag. Your Honor, these files have been verified by digital forensic experts. Metadata confirms they originated from within Skyward's Employee Conduct Division. The content reveals not only knowledge of repeated misconduct by Mr. Rowe, but deliberate suppression of passenger complaints. Judge Stokes leaned back, considering. His eyes flicked toward Ethan Rowe, whose posture stiffened. Proceed carefully, he said. The screen at the front of the courtroom came alive. Holbrook projected a series of emails. Each carried a timestamp, each signed off by mid-level supervisors. The first message appeared incident report filed. Minor passenger alleged verbal abuse by Attendant Rowe. Recommendation escalate. Beneath it, another email. Do not escalate. Family will accept voucher. Close file. The room fell silent. Holbrook clicked forward. Another chain. Passenger complaint, physical shove. Youth injured shin. Photo evidence attached. Response, mark as resolved. Record not found in archive. Do not pursue further. Grant shifted uncomfortably at the defense table, his pen tapping furiously against his pad. Ethan stared at the screen with his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. Holbrook's voice cut through. These are not isolated. The files show a pattern of burying, rewriting, or dismissing reports tied directly to the defendant. Passengers were silenced with vouchers. Staff were warned to keep quiet, and supervisors marked cases as resolved when no resolution occurred. He paused, letting the weight settle. This is not merely about one man's violence. It is about a system that protected him until a child's jaw was broken in full view of a federal judge. The gallery erupted in whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously, their screens glowing like fireflies. Grant stood abruptly. "Your Honor, the defense moves to suppress this evidence. The witness who provided these files is absent, and without testimony the documents cannot be contextualized. We are being asked to trust shadows." Judge Stokes raised a hand, and yet the shadows seem remarkably specific. Motion denied. The files are admitted. Ethan exhaled sharply, his shoulders sinking. For the first time, the mask of authority seemed to crack, leaving only the outline of a man cornered. During recess, Darius sat in the hallway with Jason Lee. The young attendant looked pale, his notebook clutched like a lifeline. "I think I know who leaked those files," Jason whispered. "We had someone in conduct review who hated what was happening. She kept notes, just like I did. She disappeared from the roster last year. Maybe she was fired, maybe she left, but I bet she's the one who sent it." Darius studied him. "Can you find her?" Jason hesitated. "Maybe, but if she wanted to stay hidden, there's a reason. Then we give her a reason to come forward," Darius said. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned. That night, while the city buzzed with headlines about the leaked files, Darius worked in silence. He pulled apart the metadata, chasing clues like footprints in the snow, a stray IP address, a routing error. Slowly, a name surfaced: Lillian Price, former compliance officer, Skyward Airlines, terminated after raising internal concerns. Darius reached for his phone. His fingers hovered, then dialed. The call connected after 3 rings. A tired voice answered. "Who is this, Ms. Price? My name is Darius Carter. My son was assaulted by Ethan Rowe." Silence, then a faint, shaky breath. "I know. I saw it on the news. You sent the files, didn't you?" Another pause. "Yes, but you don't understand. I tried before. They silenced me. They buried me." Darius's voice was steady, deliberate. "They can't silence you anymore. If you testify, if you put your name to this, the system will have no place to hide. On the other end, a long exhale. Do you know what it cost me? My career, my reputation. They called me unstable, said I fabricated complaints. If I stand up again, they'll come for me harder." "They already came for a child," Darius replied quietly, "and they will again, unless someone draws the line." The silence stretched, then Lillian spoke, her voice steadier. "Send me the details. I'll testify." The following morning, the courthouse was packed to bursting. Rumors had spread overnight that a whistleblower was coming forward. By the time Judge Stokes entered, the gallery was alive with anticipation. Halbrook called his witness. The state calls Lillian Price. The side door opened. A woman in her 40s stepped through. Her hair was tied back, her suit plain, but her presence carried a quiet gravity. She took her seat, raised her right hand, and swore the oath. Halbrook approached. "Ms. Price, please describe your role at Skyward Airlines." "I was a compliance officer in employee conduct. My job was to review passenger complaints and ensure proper action was taken." "And what did you find regarding Ethan Rowe?" Her eyes swept the jury. That complaints against him were never allowed to reach the level where action could be taken. I was told to rewrite, downgrade, or close them. When I protested, I was told I was misinterpreting tone or lacking context. Eventually, I was dismissed for being disruptive. Halbrook displayed one of the emails. This message recommending closure. Did you write it? No, that's my login, but not my words. My supervisor used my credentials to bury it. A wave of gasps moved through the gallery. Hallbrook stepped back. Ms. Price, why are you here today? She straightened. Because for years I told myself it was just my fight, that I could walk away and forget. But when I saw Malik on that stretcher, I realized silence is complicity, and I won't be complicit anymore. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Grant rose for cross-examination. His tone was sharp, almost mocking. Ms. Price, you were terminated for insubordination, correct? I was terminated for telling the truth, she replied evenly. And you only came forward after the video went viral. Her gaze didn't waver. Sometimes it takes in a child's blood to remember what truth is worth. The jurors shifted. One woman dabbed her eyes. Another man leaned forward, hands clasped tightly. By the time Lillian stepped down, the narrative had shifted again. Ethan Rowe was no longer just a violent man in uniform. He was the face of a system that had enabled him, shielded him, protected him until the truth clawed its way into daylight. Outside, the chants grew louder. Protect the children. Ground the abusers. Darius guided Malik through the crowd, the boy's hand small but steady in his own. For the first time, Darius saw a flicker of relief in his son's eyes, as though he understood he wasn't just a victim anymore. He was the reason others were finally being heard. That night, as the city lights shimmered against the courthouse windows, Darius sat alone in the quiet lounge. He held Jason's notebook in one hand, Lillian's sworn statement in the other. His mind was clear. This isn't the end, he murmured to himself. This is the beginning. And in his heart, he knew the fire he had started would burn far beyond the walls of this trial. The courthouse emptied slowly that evening, but Darius Carter did not rush to leave. He stayed in the quiet corridors, watching the marble floors gleam under the dim lights, listening to the echo of footsteps fade. The trial had shifted in his favor with the arrival of Lillian Price, but instinct told him that the defense was already plotting its counterattack. He had not survived years in strategic operations by assuming victory too early. He walked outside into the cool air of Riverside City. The plaza was still alive with voices. Protesters held candles now. Their chants softened into hymns of resilience. Cameras flickered as reporters delivered late-night updates. Darius scanned the crowd, recognizing faces of activists he had never met, but who now carried his son's name on their lips. For a brief moment, he felt the weight of it, the way a single wound could ripple outward until it touched an entire city. Later, in a diner on the east side, Darius sat at a corner booth with two men he trusted from his past. Caleb Norton, a systems engineer with a talent for tracing digital trails, and Lionel Briggs, a quiet analyst who had once unraveled entire networks of corruption. They ordered black coffee and nothing more. Darius opened his laptop, the glow illuminating his face. This isn't just about Ethan Rowe anymore. He began. It never was. The files show systemic suppression, but systems don't act on their own. People do. We need names, dates, signatures. The jury can convict Rowe, but the country needs to see the structure that protected him. Caleb leaned forward, his eyes sharp. You want to dismantle Skyward Airlines from the inside out. Darius nodded, not out of vengeance, out of necessity. If they buried this once, they will bury it again. Unless we make burying impossible. Lionel tapped his pen against a notebook. "What are you thinking? Pattern mapping," Darius said. "We cross-reference internal memos with public passenger complaints. Every gap, every mismatch. We highlight. Then we trace who signed off, who erased, who silenced. The truth isn't in one document. It's in the shadows between them. For hours they worked, fingers moving over keyboards, coffee cooling in half-drained mugs. They unearthed fragments of old employee files, ghost entries in payroll systems, traces of complaints that had been filed but marked as lost. Each discovery fed into a growing timeline of neglect. At one point, Lionel looked up, his expression grim. Ethan Rowe wasn't just protected, he was rewarded. 3 promotions in 6 years, all after documented complaints. They called him reliable under pressure. Reliable for whom Darius's jaw tightened. For them, for the people who valued silence over accountability. As dawn neared, they encrypted the files onto a slim flash drive. Darius slid it into his jacket pocket like a soldier holstering a weapon. "This is the foundation," he said, "but we need more witnesses, staff who saw, who stayed quiet because they were told to. If we show the system's human cost, it can't be ignored." That same morning, while the courthouse stirred awake, Darius met with Judge Adrian Cole in a quiet chamber. The federal judge had watched silently from the gallery in plain clothes, but his presence had not gone unnoticed. "You're moving beyond the trial," Judge Cole said, studying him. "Yes," Darius admitted, "because this trial is only the surface. My son's broken jaw is not just one man's violence. It's the end of a chain that began years ago. If we don't expose the chain, it will happen again." Judge Cole's expression was unreadable, but his eyes betrayed respect. "Careful, Mr. Carter. Courts are for cases. Crusades rarely survive here." Darius leaned forward. "Then I'll take the crusade where it belongs, into the court of public opinion, into oversight committees, into the hands of anyone who still believes children deserve safety on an airplane." The judge did not respond immediately. He studied Darius the way men measure another's resolve. Finally, he nodded once. "Then make sure you fight with precision, not just fury." That night, back at the hospital, Darius sat by Malik's bedside. The boy was stronger now, able to sit up with pillows propped behind him. He colored quietly, pressing crayons into a sketchbook. "Dad," Malik said softly, without looking up, "when people stare at me now, I feel like they're not really seeing me. They're seeing the video." Darius's chest tightened. "They're seeing what happened, yes, but you're more than that moment." Malik frowned, shading in a cloud. "Sometimes I wish no one had seen it at all." Darius placed a hand gently on his son's shoulder. "If no one had seen, they would have called you a liar. They would have buried it like they buried the others. The video isn't just your pain, it's your power." Malik looked up, his eyes searching his father's. "Does that mean I have to be strong all the time?" "No," Darius said firmly. "It means you're allowed to be a child. But while you heal, I'll carry the weight. That's my job." Malik leaned against him, small and warm, and for a moment the strategist inside Darius fell silent. He was just a father again, holding on to what mattered most. 2 days later, the trial resumed. Hallbrook presented the whistleblower testimony, the leaked files, and now fragments of the map Darius and his team had built. Though not all admissible as evidence, the presence of the pattern was undeniable. The defense grew restless, Grant's objections rising like smoke. but the momentum was shifting faster than he could contain. During a recess, Grant cornered Darius in the hallway. His voice was low, but his fury was unmistakable. "You think you can play strategist with people's lives? You're turning this into a circus." Darius met his glare without flinching. "No, I'm turning it into a reckoning." Grant's lips curled. "You're making enemies you can't see. Skyward has deep pockets. They'll drag this out, appeal every decision, smear your name until no one remembers the boy at the center of it." Darius stepped closer. "Then, they've already lost, because people will remember the boy. They'll remember the punch, and they'll remember the system that tried to erase it." Grant sneered and walked away, but his stride lacked confidence. That night, Caleb sent Darius another file. This one was heavier, darker. It contained an internal memo marked confidential. The words were clinical, but the meaning cut deep. "Avoid escalation of complaints involving minors. Children are unreliable witnesses." Darius stared at the line for a long time. His fist clenched slowly, then released. He forwarded it to Hallbrook, to Jason, to Judge Cole's aide. The system thought children were unreliable, but he would show them that a child's truth could topple empires. In the weeks to come, he spent long hours in the quiet corners of the courthouse, planning, mapping, pulling strings only he could see. Every move was deliberate, every step calculated. The strategist in him had reawakened, but this time his battlefield was not foreign soil. It was a courtroom, a city, a nation watching with bated breath, and through it all, one image drove him forward: his son's face, bruised and swollen, whispering words no child should ever have to whisper. I wasn't being rude. For Darius, that whisper had become a war cry. The morning air around Riverside Federal Courthouse was tense, charged like a storm waiting to break. Reporters swarmed the steps, their microphones bristling like spears. Protesters lined the plaza with signs that read, "Protect our children" and "Accountability in the skies." The previous week had shifted public opinion sharply. Ethan Rowe was no longer just a disgraced flight attendant. He had become the face of systemic failure, and Skyward Airlines was a name whispered with disgust across living rooms and news networks. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavier still. Every seat was filled, and the overflow crowd stood pressed against the walls, their faces pale with expectation. Court officers moved with deliberate efficiency, trying to maintain order in a space where the air itself felt combustible. At the plaintiff's table, Darius Carter sat upright, his suit pressed, his expression calm, but his eyes sharp. Beside him, Malik shifted in his wheelchair, still frail but determined. The boy wore a navy blazer that hung slightly loose on his small frame. His bandages were lighter now, but the scars still glowed beneath his skin. He carried a presence far greater than his years, though Darius wished more than anything that he didn't have to. Across the aisle, Ethan Rowe sat between his attorneys, his posture tense, his jaw tight. He wore a navy suit chosen by his defense team, but it did nothing to mask the twitch of his hands, the way his foot tapped nervously beneath the table. Grant Maruro whispered to him constantly, his voice sharp, clipped, filled with rehearsed strategies. Judge Wilton Stokes entered and the courtroom rose. His stern gaze swept the room before he sat. "We proceed with cross-examination," he announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. The prosecutor, Harold Hallbrook, rose slowly. He carried no papers this time, only a tablet. His voice was steady, deliberate. "The jury has heard testimony. They have seen video, but they must also understand intent. Mr. Rowe has claimed reflex, a startled response. Today, we will test that claim. The defense objected immediately, but the judge allowed Holbrook to continue. Holbrook tapped the tablet and the screen flickered alive. The video from the plane began to play once more, frame by frame, slowed to almost unbearable pace. The jury watched as Ethan turned, as his shoulder shifted, as his hand tightened into a fist. The punch landed with sickening clarity. "Stop there," Holbrook ordered. The frame froze, Ethan's fist inches from Malik's jaw. "Ladies and gentlemen, look at this image. Do you see fear? Do you see panic? Or do you see preparation?" The courtroom was silent except for the soft hum of the projector. Grant rose, his voice cutting. Objection, interpretation should be left to experts, not prosecutors. Holbrook smiled faintly. "Then let us bring in the experts." The doors opened and Dr. Adrian Bell entered, a specialist in human motion analysis. He took the stand, his calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the tension around him. He explained the markers of anticipatory aggression, the subtle shift of weight, the preparation of muscles, the focus of eyes. He demonstrated using digital overlays on the footage, showing how Ethan's body had coiled not in fear, but in deliberate preparation. The jury leaned forward, eyes narrowing, absorbing every word. Grant tried to dismantle the testimony, bringing up alternative interpretations, but Dr. Bell remained composed. "Fear is reactive," he said softly. "Preparation is intentional. What you see here is not reflex, it is choice." The words lingered like smoke. During the recess, Ethan slammed his fist against the defense table, whispering furiously to Grant, "They're painting me like a monster. I was provoked." Why won't they believe that Grant leaned in close? Because the boy looks like innocence itself, and innocence always wins sympathy. But remember, sympathy does not always equal conviction. Stay calm. Let me steer this. But Ethan was unraveling. His eyes darted across the room, catching glimpses of the jury, of Malik's small frame, of Darius's steady presence. Rage flickered inside him. He'd spent years asserting authority on flights, years believing his uniform shielded him. Now that shield was crumbling. When the court reconvened, Holbrook stood again. He surprised the room with a simple declaration. "The prosecution calls Malik Carter." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously. Darius's heart clenched, but he had known this moment was coming. He turned to his son, kneeling slightly so their eyes met. "You don't have to," he whispered. Malik's voice was small but steady. "I want to, with the help of a bailiff." Malik wheeled forward to the witness stand. The room seemed to shrink around him. His hands trembled slightly as he took the oath, his voice barely audible. But once seated, he lifted his head and looked directly at the jury. Holbrook approached gently. "Malik, I only have 3 questions. Take your time. If you need a break, you tell me." Malik nodded. "First," Holbrook said, "did you touch Mr. Rowe before he struck you?" The boy's voice was soft but clear. "Second, did you say anything threatening to him?" Again, "No." Holbrook paused, his voice lowering. "And third, Malik, can you tell the jury what Mr. Rowe said to you right before he hit you?" The room fell into absolute silence, every ear strained, every breath held. Malik swallowed, his lips trembling, but his eyes did not leave the jury. He said, "Let's see you talk now." The words sliced through the courtroom like lightning. The gallery erupted in gasps. Even Judge Stokes leaned back slightly, his expression shaken. Ethan's face drained of color. His jaw twitched. His eyes darted toward the floor. Grant whispered something sharply. But it was too late. The words had already seared themselves into the jury's memory. Holbrook thanked Malik softly and asked no further questions. As the boy was wheeled back to his father, the jury watched him with a mixture of sorrow and admiration. Darius leaned down, kissed his son's forehead, and whispered, "You were braver than anyone in this room." The defense tried to recover. Grant called Dr. Leonard Bryce, the body language expert they had prepared. He argued that stress could create misinterpretations, that sudden movements could seem deliberate when they were not. But the damage was done. The contrast between Malik's trembling honesty and Roe's growing agitation was impossible to ignore. When the day ended, the crowd outside was larger than ever. Chants shook the courthouse steps. Journalists shouted questions. Protesters held candles that flickered against the night sky. Inside his hotel room, Darius sat alone, staring at the city lights. He should have felt relief, but instead he felt a strange unease. Victories in trials were fragile things. He knew the defense would pivot, would attack the system instead of just Roe. And in truth, he wanted them to, because he had gathered enough to show that Skyward Airlines was not merely negligent, it was complicit. He picked up the flash drive on the table and held it between his fingers. Inside was the evidence that could shift the battle entirely. He whispered to himself, "Tomorrow, the flames rise higher, and outside, in the restless city, the storm was already gathering." The courthouse the following morning felt like the eye of a storm. Outside, cameras clicked in rapid bursts, reporters leaned over barricades, and protesters waved handmade signs, their voices echoing against the marble facade. Inside, however, a quiet anticipation hung heavy. Everyone knew something was about to shift. The defense had taken blow after blow, and now the air smelled of desperation. Darius Carter entered the courtroom with Malik by his side. The boy's small hand clutched his father's sleeve as if drawing strength from the calm presence beside him. Darius leaned down, his voice steady. "Remember, you don't have to speak again. You've done more than enough." Malik gave a small nod. He seemed fragile in his wheelchair, but there was a glimmer in his eyes, the resilience of someone who had carried more than any child should. Ethan Roe was already seated across the aisle. His face looked pale, almost waxen under the courtroom lights. His suit, once sharp, seemed to hang awkwardly as if even the fabric had abandoned him. His lawyer, Grant Maruro, whispered urgently in his ear, but Ethan's attention drifted toward the jury, then toward Malik, and finally downward to the polished wood of the defense table. He avoided eye contact with everyone, as though his very posture confessed to the weight pressing down on him. Judge Wilton Stokes adjusted his glasses and called the session to order. His voice carried an unmistakable gravity. "We proceed with additional evidence from the plaintiff." The statement rippled through the room. The jury leaned forward. The gallery hushed. Harold Holbrook, the prosecutor, rose with the air of a man who had prepared for this very moment. His tone was calm, deliberate. "Your Honor, in addition to witness testimony and video evidence, the plaintiff's side has secured documentation and internal communications from Skyward Airlines that shed light not only on this incident, but on a disturbing pattern. Grant immediately shot up, objecting, irrelevant. This case is about Mr. Rowe, not about corporate bureaucracy. Judge Stokes raised a hand. Objection noted. Mr. Holbrook, you will need to establish clear relevance. Holbrook nodded. I intend to. He stepped toward the screen at the front of the courtroom and clicked the remote. A series of emails appeared, projected large enough for everyone to read. They were internal messages between supervisors at Skyward Airlines. One line drew audible gasps from the gallery. It read, avoid escalating complaints involving legacy crew, especially with minors. They are unreliable witnesses. The words burned across the screen. Holbrook let the silence linger before continuing. Ladies and gentlemen, this was written by a supervisor at Skyward. It was circulated to managers responsible for reviewing complaints against employees, including Mr. Rowe. These are not isolated words. They represent a culture. Grant objected again, but the judge overruled him this time. The jury will decide how much weight to give this evidence. Holbrook continued, showing report after report that had been flagged, altered, or buried. Complaints from passengers had been rewritten to sound like minor misunderstandings. One described a boy with special needs who had been berated by Ethan Rowe 18 months prior. Another detailed an elderly passenger reduced to tears after a shouting tirade. Each document bore signatures, timestamps, and quiet notations like resolved internally or no further action. The courtroom atmosphere changed with every page. The jury shifted in their seats, some shaking their heads, some whispering under their breath. The gallery buzzed with restrained outrage. Darius watched silently, his jaw set. He had anticipated this. The evidence was the spark he had spent weeks gathering with the help of allies who risked careers to expose the truth. But even he felt a chill at hearing the words spoken aloud in this chamber. It was no longer strategy on a laptop in a quiet diner. It was here, undeniable, in front of 12 jurors who held Ethan's fate in their hands. Grant finally rose, his voice louder now. This is a distraction. The prosecution is smearing an entire corporation to inflame emotions. Mr. Rowe is on trial, not Skyward Airlines. Holbrook turned to the jury, his voice dropping lower, steady as a blade. And yet, Mr. Rowe was protected by Skyward Airlines, shielded, enabled. Every complaint that could have warned us was buried. If this case were only about one man's temper, we would not be here. We are here because a system allowed violence to grow unchecked until it landed on Malik Carter's face. A murmur of agreement rippled through the gallery. Judge Stokes banged his gavel for silence, but the energy in the room could not be extinguished. Ethan sat rigid, his knuckles white around the edge of the table. His breathing grew shallow. He whispered to Grant, "They're turning this on the company. They'll throw me under the bus." Grant's lips tightened. "Stay quiet. Let me handle it." But the attorney's own hands trembled as he adjusted his papers. Even he sensed the defense collapsing. When recess came, the courthouse lobby erupted with reporters scrambling for statements. Protesters outside lit candles, chanting Malik's name as though he were a symbol larger than himself. Inside a private conference room, Darius sat with Judge Adrian Cole, who had quietly observed much of the trial without drawing attention to himself. Cole leaned forward, his voice low. The jury already sees the truth. But this is bigger than Rowe. You know it. I know it. What matters is whether you want to pursue accountability beyond this trial. Darius's expression didn't waver. I didn't come this far to stop halfway. My son deserves more than one man's conviction. He deserves a system that won't let this happen again. Cole nodded, his eyes reflecting the weight of decades on the bench. Then, brace yourself, because when systems fall, they fight back. Back in the courtroom, the defense tried to rally. Grant called Ethan himself to the stand. It was a gamble. Ethan's testimony could humanize him, or it could seal his fate. Ethan adjusted his tie nervously and began to speak. He told the jury that he had felt threatened, that Malik had startled him with sudden movements, that his reaction was instinctive. His voice cracked at times, his words rushed. He painted himself as a man overwhelmed by stress, a worker stretched thin by long hours and difficult passengers, but the jury's faces remained stony, and when Halbrook stood for cross-examination, the final cracks split wide open. "Mr. Rowe," Halbrook said evenly, "do you remember what you said to Malik Carter right before striking him?" Ethan hesitated. "No, it was chaotic. I don't recall exact words." Halbrook's eyes narrowed. "You don't recall saying, 'Let's see you talk now.'" Ethan shifted uncomfortably. I don't remember that." Halbrook played the courtroom recording once more. Malik's trembling voice filled the speakers. He said, "Let's see you talk now." The silence that followed was suffocating. Ethan's face collapsed into a mask of panic. His hands fumbled at the edge of the witness box. His denial had just shattered under the weight of a child's truth. The judge called for order, but the jury no longer looked at Ethan as a man under pressure. They looked at him as someone who had lied, someone who had tried to twist reality to protect himself. The defense had gambled and lost. By the time the session adjourned, the courthouse buzzed like a hive. News alerts flashed across phones. Protesters' chants grew louder. Ethan Rowe was no longer simply on trial for his actions. He had become the emblem of a system collapsing under its own corruption. That evening, Darius sat by Malik's hospital bed. The boy had dozed off, a faint smile on his lips as cartoons flickered quietly on the muted television. Darius placed a hand gently over his son's. His voice was low, meant for no one but the child resting beside him. "You were right to speak. You made them listen." He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He knew tomorrow would bring another battle, perhaps fiercer than the last. But for tonight, in the quiet hum of the hospital room, he allowed himself a moment of stillness. The storm was still raging, but his son had already begun to heal, and for Darius Carter, that healing was reason enough to keep fighting until the entire system stood exposed. The courtroom filled early the next morning, every seat occupied, every corridor echoing with hushed voices. It was the day the jury would return with its verdict. Outside, the steps of the courthouse were packed with protesters and camera crews, their chants and questions rising like waves against the stone walls. Inside, the air carried a fragile silence, the kind that comes just before history shifts. Darius Carter guided Malik's wheelchair to their usual place near the plaintiff's table. The boy sat quietly, his eyes darting between the rows of jurors' chairs and the large clock on the far wall. He wore a navy sweater, the sleeves slightly too long, his small fingers fidgeting at the cuffs. Darius bent down, speaking softly. "Remember, no matter what happens today, you've already won. You told the truth. That's something no verdict can erase." Malik gave a tiny nod. He looked tired but steady, as though he understood the gravity in a way that went beyond his 10 years. Across the aisle, Ethan Rowe sat with his attorney Grant Maruro. The once confident flight attendant now looked hollow. His eyes were bloodshot, his posture slumped. He tapped his fingers nervously against the table until Grant placed a firm hand over them. Stillness. The attorney whispered sharply, though his own expression betrayed unease. He knew how fragile their defense had become, how thin their arguments had sounded against the avalanche of evidence. Judge Wilton Stokes entered and took his seat. The gavel struck once, echoing through the chamber. This court will come to order. Bailiff, please escort the jury. The doors at the side of the room opened. 12 jurors filed in, their expressions grave, their steps deliberate. Not one of them glanced toward Ethan. They settled into their seats, and the foreman, a man in his 50s with silver hair and a solemn gaze, stood holding a folded sheet of paper. Judge Stokes addressed him directly. "Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied, his voice steady but tinged with the weight of responsibility. The bailiff took the paper, handed it to the judge, and the room froze as Judge Stokes unfolded it. His eyes moved across the words. Then he looked up. His voice was measured, deliberate. "In the case of the state versus Ethan Rowe, on the charge of aggravated assault of a minor, the jury finds the defendant guilty. On the charge of abuse of authority in a custodial setting, the jury finds the defendant guilty. On the charge of infliction of intentional harm, the jury finds the defendant guilty." A collective gasp spread through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously, the sound of pens scratching against paper filling the air. Protesters outside, hearing the news relayed by phones, erupted into cheers that faintly seeped through the courthouse walls. Ethan's body sagged as though the words had knocked the strength from him. His mouth opened, but no sound came. Grant's hand tightened on his client's shoulder, trying to project calm, but the attorney's eyes revealed what his lips did not. This was the end of their defense. Malik shifted in his seat, his wide eyes fixed on the judge. Darius placed a reassuring hand on his son's arm. "It's over," he whispered. Malik swallowed hard, then leaned against his father, as if the weight of the past weeks was finally catching up to him. Judge Stokes raised his gavel once more. "Sentencing will be scheduled within 48 hours, pending review of newly submitted corporate evidence tied to the case. Court is adjourned." The strike of the gavel thundered like a final note. The room erupted into noise. Some cried quietly, others embraced. Reporters shouted questions as security escorted Ethan toward the side door. His face was pale, lips pressed tight, refusing to answer. The cameras caught every angle, his fall from authority now etched into the public record. In the quiet that followed, Darius bent low beside Malik. "You did this," he said, his voice trembling just slightly. "Your courage made this possible." Malik blinked at him, then gave a shy, fragile smile. It was the first real smile Darius had seen since the night of the assault. Later that afternoon, Darius and Judge Adrian Cole met in a narrow hallway of the courthouse, away from cameras. Cole's expression was thoughtful, his brow furrowed. "The jury's decision is important, but you know as well as I do this doesn't end with one man. What you expose today is a culture, a pattern of silence. Are you ready for what comes next?" Darius didn't hesitate. "I've been ready since the night I saw my son's face in that hospital bed. This verdict was justice for him. But now we go after the structure that let this happen. Cole nodded, his eyes shining with something close to pride. Then, let's prepare. Systems don't crumble quietly. They fight back. That evening, as dusk settled over the city, the courthouse steps glowed under television lights. Reporters shouted questions. Protesters waved signs, and chants of Malik's name filled the air. Darius stood at the top of the steps beside his son, who sat quietly in his wheelchair, the collar of his sweater pulled up against the evening chill. A reporter called out, "Mr. Carter, what does this verdict mean to you and your family?" Darius paused, scanning the sea of microphones. His voice was calm, each word deliberate, carrying over the crowd. "This verdict means the truth was heard. It means a child's voice was not silenced. But justice is not finished. Today was about accountability for one man. Tomorrow must be about accountability for an entire system that let him believe he could strike a child and walk away." The crowd erupted in cheers. Malik lowered his gaze, overwhelmed by the noise, but Darius leaned close. "They're cheering because of you," he whispered. Malik's lips curved into another faint smile, and for a brief moment the boy allowed himself to feel the strength of 1,000 voices rising in his defense, inside a quiet conference room just blocks away. Executives at Skyward Airlines sat in tense silence as news of the verdict played across muted televisions. Their CEO, Leonard Graves, stared at the screen, his jaw clenched. Around him, lawyers and public relations officers whispered urgently, drafting statements, spinning narratives. But the truth was undeniable. They were no longer protecting an employee. They were fighting for the survival of their brand. One lawyer leaned close to Graves. "If the subcommittee takes this further, oversight will be inevitable. You may want to consider stepping down before you're forced." Graves said nothing. His reflection on the black television screen looked older, more fragile than the man he imagined himself to be. For the first time in years, he felt the grip of something larger than him, something he could not control. Meanwhile, Darius sat in a hospital room beside Malik's bed. The boy had fallen asleep quickly, exhaustion finally winning after days of tension. Darius watched his son breathe, steady and calm. He thought of the path ahead, the hearings, the corporate accountability, the battles yet to come. But for tonight, he let himself feel the quiet. He whispered softly, "You were brave, and because of you, things will change." Malik stirred slightly in his sleep, a peaceful smile flickering across his face. For the first time since the nightmare began, Darius felt something that had eluded him hope. The courthouse, the protests, the verdicts, the corporate fallout, those battles would continue. But tonight, in the stillness of a hospital room, a father sat beside his son and allowed himself to believe that even in a broken system, truth could still find its voice. The courthouse was filled once again. 48 hours had passed since the jury delivered its verdict, and now it was time for sentencing. The air was heavy with anticipation, the marble walls echoing faint whispers as people found their seats. Ethan Rowe stood at the defense table, flanked by his attorneys. His suit was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted, but his posture betrayed him. Shoulders sagging, eyes bloodshot, he looked like a man who had run out of roads to escape. His attorney, Grant Maruro, leaned in close, whispering, "Stay calm, show respect. It might lessen the blow." Ethan gave a stiff nod, though his jaw twitched. At the opposite table, Darius Carter sat beside Malik. The boy's jaw was still partially bandaged, his body healing slowly but surely. He wore a button-down shirt, freshly pressed, and sat upright in his wheelchair. His eyes didn't waver, not from the crowd nor from the man who had struck him. He had learned, painfully, that silence can sometimes be a prison. But today, he was determined to be present, not hidden. Judge Wilton Stokes entered, his black robe trailing with deliberate gravity. He took his seat, surveyed the room, and raised his gavel. The sound carried through the chamber, silencing every murmur. Mr. Rowe. The judge began, his voice stern yet steady. This court finds it especially disturbing that the victim in this case was not only a child, but a child placed in your care. The duty of a flight attendant is to ensure safety and dignity for all passengers, particularly minors traveling alone. You failed that duty in the most violent way imaginable. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, but the judge continued. You are hereby sentenced to 9 years in federal prison, without the possibility of early parole. A collective murmur rippled through the gallery. Some gasped, others nodded quietly. Ethan's face went pale. He clenched his jaw, staring down at the table, refusing to look at anyone. Grant Maruro scribbled notes furiously, already preparing for appeal, but the weight of the sentence was clear. This was no small reprimand. This was a life rewritten. The guards approached, their movements practiced. They clipped cold steel cuffs around Ethan's wrists. The man who once towered over a boy with clenched fists now looked diminished, shoulders bent beneath the gravity of justice. As they led him away, a reporter called out from the gallery, "Mr. Rowe, do you have anything to say to Malik Carter?" But Ethan kept his eyes fixed on the floor. No apology, no acknowledgement, just silence as the door closed behind him. In the quiet that followed, Judge Stokes addressed the court. Justice has been delivered in this matter, but let this serve as a reminder that power is responsibility, and when abused, it carries consequence. The gavel struck once more. Court was adjourned. Outside, the courthouse steps were a storm of flashing cameras and raised microphones. Reporters jostled for space, protesters raised signs, and chants filled the air. But Darius didn't linger. He pushed Malik's wheelchair past the chaos, ignoring the calls for comment. For now, the noise wasn't for them. Their victory was private, sacred. Later that evening, in a quiet office 2 floors above the courtroom, Judge Adrian Cole met with Darius and a small group of lawmakers. Papers were spread across the table, evidence not admitted during the trial but damning nonetheless, buried complaints, ignored warnings, emails laced with bias. "This is bigger than one man," Darius said, his voice calm but edged with conviction. "It's a system designed to silence children, to protect reputations instead of passengers." Cole nodded. "And now the nation is listening. We'll convene a federal subcommittee on aviation safety and employee conduct. You'll be asked to testify. Mr. Carter, your perspective matters." Darius leaned back, his mind steady. He had once built strategies for corporations and governments, but now his strategy was simpler truth, revealed piece by piece, until the system had no place to hide. News broke within hours. Skyward Airlines' CEO Leonard Graves announced his resignation, his voice trembling at a hastily arranged press conference. "In light of recent revelations, I am stepping down effective immediately," he said. No questions were taken. Behind him, a screen showed protesters gathered outside the airline's headquarters, their chants growing louder by the hour. Skyward's stock plummeted 11% in a single afternoon. Calls for reform spread across the industry. Other airlines scrambled to review their policies, fearing they would be next. The ripple effect had begun. But for Darius, the true focus remained his son. Weeks later, Malik sat in a new wheelchair in the center of Skyland International Airport's freshly unveiled Safe Passages Lounge. The space was bright and warm, with colorful murals of paper airplanes and kites stretching across the walls. Soft chairs lined the room, shelves filled with books donated by local schools, and quiet music played from hidden speakers. It looked nothing like the sterile waiting areas Malik remembered. He gripped a small note card in his hands. Reporters and children sat before him, waiting. Darius stood in the front row, his eyes steady on his son. Malik's heart pounded, but he cleared his throat and began to read. "I was hurt on a plane," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. "But I'm not just a victim. I'm still flying. And I want all of you to know that even when adults get it wrong, there are others who will fight to make it right." The room fell silent. His words, though simple, carried a weight far beyond his years. When he lowered the card, gentle applause rose from the audience, not loud, not overwhelming, just enough to honor the courage it took to speak. Darius stood, his chest tight with emotion, and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Malik looked up at him, and for the first time since the assault, his smile was unguarded. Outside, reporters asked Darius how it felt to see justice done. He looked back through the glass at Malik, who was now showing a younger boy how to fasten a seatbelt correctly. "Justice is never finished," Darius said, his voice steady, "but sometimes it begins with a boy who refused to be silenced." That night, in the quiet of their home, Malik curled under his blanket, his favorite hoodie pulled close. Darius sat at the edge of the bed, scrolling absent-mindedly through headlines about reforms, resignations, and hearings. Malik shifted slightly and whispered, "Dad, yes, buddy. Do you think he's sorry?" Darius paused, staring at the ceiling. "Maybe," he said finally. "But whether he is or not, that's not our burden anymore." Malik nodded and pulled the blanket tighter. "I'm not afraid of flying now. Not anymore." Darius leaned down, kissed his son's forehead, and whispered, "You don't have to be. Not ever again." Outside their window, planes rumbled faintly in the night sky, but inside, for the first time in months, there was peace. What began with a broken jaw ended with a broken system exposed. Malik Carter's voice, once trembling with fear, became a beacon for every child told to stay quiet. His father's resolve tore through walls of corporate silence, and a nation was forced to ask, who do we trust when trust is betrayed at 30,000 feet? This story is not only about accountability in one courtroom. It is about the dignity every passenger deserves, the responsibility every uniform carries, and the courage required to confront prejudice wherever it hides. As you reflect on Malik's journey on the pain, the resilience, and the reforms sparked in its wake, ask yourself, how would you stand if silence demanded your compliance? Would you choose comfort or justice? We honor Malik not just as a victim, but as a survivor whose courage reshaped the skies, and we condemn, without hesitation, the abuse of power and the stain of discrimination. If this story moved you, let it move you to act. Like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel so together we can continue telling stories that fight for dignity, truth, and change.